In another video that surfaced on social media on the 12th of January, dozens of bodies can be seen lying inside and outside Tehran's morgue. This was when the death toll was reported to be around 648. The deadly crackdown on Iranian protesters has triggered protests around the world, from Montreal to Milan and Australia's Sydney. Protesters came out against the crackdown in the West Asian country. However, there are parallel pro-government demonstrations that have taken place as well. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself hailed people turning up for pro-government demonstrations. In fact, pro-Khamenei protests took place in India as well. They took place in Ladakh's Leh region. The demonstrations took place in Kargil as well, where hundreds gathered on the streets, raising slogans and waving Indian and Iranian flags. As tensions continue to mount in and around Iran, the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has urged the Iranian army to side with the protesters.
و اما پیام ویژه‌ای دارم به پرسنل ارتش. شما ارتش ملی ایران هستید، نه ارتش جمهوری اسلامی. وظیفه دارید از جان همیهنانتون حفاظت بکنید. فرصت زیادی براتون نمونده. به مردم هرچه زودتر بپیوندید.
So far, the Iranian armed forces have maintained their loyalty to the regime. There are no reports of widespread defections as of now. Iranian forces are spearheading the crackdown on the protesters. Let's dive deeper into Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's structure of power at the moment. The entire system of governance centers around the Iranian supreme leader. He commands control over 4 key components of the regime. The supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Men serving the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, and Artish report directly to the supreme leader. After the supreme leader comes the president and the Guardian Council, who serve as the executive head and constitutional gatekeeper, respectively. The president oversees the National Security Council, and all the laws passed by the parliament must be approved by the Guardian Council, who directly reports to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The power trickles down the hierarchy, but the ultimate authority remains with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Even a smallest crack in the system can trigger a collapse, but so far, the pillars of Khamenei regime seem to be standing intact with him. All right, let's try and get a perspective on the Iranian situation. At the moment, I'm joined by Dr. Kadira Pethi Yagoda. He's a geopolitical expert and an Australian diplomat joining us live from London. Dr. Kadira, good evening. I want to start by asking you what you think of Reza Pahlavi's urge for the Iranian army, for Artesh to join the protesters. So far, we haven't seen the defections, and we all know that one of the crucial things to happen for any regime change in any part of the world, in any country, is for their army personnel to defect. So far, that hasn't happened.
Yes, and it's unlikely to happen, I would say, because you've got, despite what's being said in the Western media, there isn't a popular opposition in Iran that's large enough to actually trigger a complete regime change. The original protests were by business owners who were unhappy with economic issues, but were actually supportive of the Ayatollah. And then afterwards, you've had these kind of external involvement, which you've had the US Secretary of State admit that there were Mossad agents working with the rioters. And you've had Israeli media kind of admit that as well. And then in addition to that, if there is an external attack by the US, that really increases nationalism. So even though the army's officers, even those who may dislike the clerical rule, they would still fear state collapse even more. And secondly, you've got a system in Iran where it's very dispersed, and it's intentionally so. So you've got the regular army, the Artesh, and the IRGC being separate. And the IRGC is ideologically loyal, it's entrenched, and its survival is tied to the regime survival. So there's no real single decisive pivot point.
Right. So, Dr. Kadira, just the very fact that the IRGC is tied ideologically and, its entire existence centers around the supreme leader and to protect the ideology, do you therefore think that the United States has realized this time around as well, that it's going to be hard to get into the security apparatus of the supreme leader and sort of try and get this regime change done?
Yeah, I'm sure that the various people in the US hierarchy in the government understand this completely. These have been things that have long been known, that the IRGC's assets are dispersed, they're underground, they're often dual use, they're mobile, they're embedded in civilian areas. You've got air defenses that have been supported by the Russians. You've got missile retaliation capability. I think the real issue in the US government is not whether they understand the challenges, but whether they are willing to undertake a strike anyway, because you do have a lot of neocons in Trump's cabinet, and they may just, they have a tendency to use the US military not to achieve strategic objectives, but rather to support the economic interests of the military-industrial complex.
And so, therefore, how do you see this moving forward? Because you've got anti-regime protesters in Iran. You've also got pro-government demonstrations that are countering these protests. And the world over, of course, there is mixed reactions coming in. There's the Iranian diaspora also weighing in on this entire situation that is unfolding in their home country.
Yeah, so I think what we may see is US strikes, but not enough to actually overthrow the government. And you may see Israel get involved there as well. And I think, if there actually was to be a regime change in Iran, I think that would have real major negative implications in terms of fragmentation. The country would effectively split up to different groups. You'd see issues and problems for countries like India, where with access to Chabahar threatened, it would create enormous energy disruptions, and it would weaken India and China's role as rising powers in the Middle East. So I think that stability is probably what's in the best interest of most countries going forward.
That's right, and we hope Iran achieves that stability soon. I'll leave it there. Dr. Kadira, thank you very much for joining us on WION and sharing your perspective.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about Greenland. Greenland and Denmark are preparing for a White House showdown. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be hosting foreign ministers of both Denmark and Greenland. The high-stakes meeting comes amid President Donald Trump's repeated threats to seize control of Greenland. Just ahead of this meeting, Greenland has said that if it has to choose between America and Denmark, it will go with Denmark. Trump has called Greenland an important component of his Golden Dome project, which is his flagship air and missile defense system plan. He asserts that owning Greenland would further embolden NATO's defenses. In fact, he took a jibe at Denmark once again, asking it to get Russians and Chinese out. The showdown on Greenland is a complex interplay of security and resources. The Arctic nation is a home to one of the world's largest rare earth deposits. Its geographical positioning is strategic as well. The melting ice is opening up new sea routes in the north, and Donald Trump fears that China and Russia would dominate this contested territory. This sets the stage for difficult talks ahead. As both Denmark and US are NATO members, the failure of diplomacy could threaten NATO's cohesion. The give and take on the diplomatic chessboard will likely include exclusive American military presence, extraction rights of rare earths, and maintaining distance from China and Russia. But the doubt still persists whether Donald Trump's plan to own Greenland is negotiable. Far from the diplomatic churn, most Americans believe that Greenland and Denmark are allies and oppose any military action against the island. According to the latest poll by YouGov, the majority of Americans see Greenland as a friendly territory. Almost 35% of Americans say it is friendly, while 26% call Greenland an ally. only 2% respondents believe that Greenland is an enemy of the United States of America. In fact, Americans have a clearer stance on Denmark. Almost 64% believe that Denmark is friendly with the US, while only 7% say that the country is unfriendly. On the issue of military action to take over Greenland, a majority of 68% people oppose this move, while only 8% support it. A majority of Republican respondents also oppose the direct military takeover of Greenland.
I don't know how to prepare myself and my son. I have a 6-year-old, so I don't know how to prepare.
Overwhelming. That I can put that in one word. It is quite overwhelming, especially with the example he set with Venezuela.
It will happen. The United States will try to buy Greenland, or they will invade it. They have anger. They're very upset. They're frightened.
Meanwhile, the Washington summit on Greenland could pave the way for two things: confrontation or cooperation. And until then, the fate of Greenland hangs in balance. Every passing day, more and more Americans might just be rejecting the US's top political parties. A new Gallup survey says that young adults in the United States of America are inclined to support the Democrats or the Republicans. In fact, according to this survey, just under 45% of American adults now identify as independents. Over half of Generation Z or Gen Z and the millennials identify as political independents, while a majority of older generations side with a party. Data shows this is a substantial shift from 20 years ago, when closer to 1/3 of Americans said that they did not identify with the Democrats or Republicans. Gallup's analysis says that the young adults appears to be increasingly unhappy with the party, that is, the Republicans in power. That's a dynamic that could be good for the Democrats in this year's midterm elections, but doesn't promise lasting loyalty. In the last 15 years, the number of independents have increased significantly, and this year the Democrats gained the partisanship edge. According to the survey, nearly half, 47% of US adults now identify as Democrats or lean toward the Democratic Party, while 42% are Republicans or they lean Republican. More independents have described their political views as moderate over the last decade, while Democrats and Republicans have grown less likely to identify as moderates. So the edge that Republicans had when Joe Biden was in power has worn off. About 47% of the independents called themselves moderates in 2025, as compared to about 3 in 10 Democrats and 2 in 10 Republicans. This creates another challenge for the parties to contend with, since appeals to the center to win the growing pool of independents could risk alienating the most committed people in their bases. Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, is balancing between the country's path back to normalcy and the Trumpian oil ambitions. In the meantime, Donald Trump is set to meet Nobel Peace Laureate and Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. This will be the first time that the American president will be meeting any opposition leader since the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Trump has previously said that Machado lacks support in Venezuela as she continues to work with interim leader who served as Maduro's deputy. The meeting between the Nobel Peace Prize winner and its aspirant will be one to watch out for. But just before this meeting, Venezuela's interim leader initiated a friendly gesture towards Washington. Venezuela started freeing jailed political prisoners. According to Venezuela's top lawmaker, Jorge Rodriguez, over 400 people have been freed from prisons so far as part of a process announced last week. Now, these include some Americans as well. However, the number of American detainees that have been released remains unclear so far. Earlier, remember, Venezuela had freed Spanish and Italian citizens from its prisons. According to Venezuela's leading NGO, Foro Penal, only 60 to 70 prisoners have been released so far. The NGO, in fact, complains about the slow pace of releases and lack of information from the authorities. The group recorded at least 800 political prisoners in Venezuelan jails at the start of this year. The release of political prisoners, Washington's oil gambit for Caracas, and Trump meeting with Maria Corina Machado. Every stakeholder is now moving its pieces in Venezuela's race to power. Shifting our focus now to the African continent, Uganda's presidential election has been shadowed by a hardening internet crackdown. This, remember, comes ahead of voting as President Yoweri Museveni seeks to extend his 4-decade rule with a 7th term. The Ugandan government maintains that the blackout is to prevent misinformation. It has previously dismissed claims about the internet shutdown, saying the reports are false and misleading. Web monitor NetBlocks confirmed a nationwide disruption. Meanwhile, opposition supporters have been detained and foreign media are being kept out. The critics have called it a digital tactic designed to control the narrative at a decisive moment. Museveni recently held his final campaign rally as a grand show of power, yet a tightly controlled one. Thousands filled the national ceremonial gardens, but foreign journalists were not welcome there. They were denied access to this rally and some were threatened with arrest. The 81-year-old has been in power for 40 years and is seeking yet another term. Museveni is widely expected to win. He maintains total control over the state and the security apparatus. He has allegedly rewritten the rules, scrapped term and age limits, and jailed rivals to stay in power.
Anybody who tries to interfere with your freedom will be crushed. I'm telling you this.
The face of the opposition is popular singer-turned-politician Bobby Wine. As Uganda expects to start commercial crude oil production later this year, Wine has campaigned on a promise to revise international agreements. He has attested that security forces blocked from campaigning in certain areas and that hundreds of his supporters have been detained.
We are constantly provoked by the police and military. They block our road. They tear gas us without any reason. There has always been a constant provocation because they want us to behave. They want us to get angry. They want to provoke violence. They want to provoke stone throwing so they can get justification for shooting our people.
The United Nations backs the claim, confirming large-scale arrests of opposition supporters in the run-up to the elections. Security forces have repeatedly fired live bullets and tear gas to break what President Museveni calls the criminal opposition. More than 20 million people are registered to vote in Uganda on Thursday. With this, the East African country, with a young electorate, is heading into a crucial stage of leadership change. But the warning signs against a democratic election are flashing red. On to Europe now, where farmers are back on the streets across the European continent. From Paris to Poland, Belgium to Greece, the anger is over the EU-Mercosur trade deal, and it is spilling onto the streets. The agreement was in the making for the last 25 years. Farmers fear that cheap imports will undercut their livelihoods. This, remember, as Brussels moves closer to signing the deal. These visuals are from Paris. In the ongoing protests that lasted throughout the night, farmers gathered at multiple landmarks across the French capital, including the Arc de Triomphe and the National Assembly building. Fuming French farmers camped out despite the government's promises. They waved flags, chanted slogans, and heckled National Assembly Speaker Yael Braun-Pivet. The protesters say the Mercosur deal will flood Europe with cheaper agricultural imports, putting local farmers at risk.
vu que les tracteurs ont commencé à...
You saw that the tractors have started heading back to their farms because overnight there were discussions with Agriculture Minister Annie Genevard about the cash flow problems our farms are facing. Those talks provided guarantees on the restructuring loans needed after several bad years, which many farmers had been expecting, but which were not announced yesterday by French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu. That's why this very late-night exchange allowed the whole delegation to secure the guarantees we needed.
Chercher ces garanties nécessaires.
In Greece, meanwhile, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis held talks with farmer representatives. The government offered tax cuts, lower energy costs and compensation to diffuse the tensions. But many farmers rejected these talks, calling the Mercosur deal a threat to their survival.
After 45 days, this burden cannot continue. The government exhausted the economy's capacity, supporting farmers more than ever. It also exhausted the limits of its understanding for a sector that it has stood by for years. We will not tolerate blackmail, illegalities or absurdities, and of course we will not create an injustice for the rest of society.
Now, what is the European Union Mercosur deal? The EU-Mercosur deal has been 25 years in the making. It involves Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay. And it would be the EU's largest trade agreement in terms of tariff cuts. Germany, Spain and the Nordic countries say that it will boost exports and reduce reliance on China. However, the farmers fear an influx of cheap meat and grains. For farmers across Europe, the clock is ticking. The protests are showing no signs of slowing down. In Belgium, farmers blocked highways near Brussels. In Poland, hundreds rallied in Warsaw, urging lawmakers to seize the deal. In Ireland, on the other hand, farmers took to the streets after EU member states cleared the way for signing. Despite the backlash, EU member states have approved this agreement at a diplomatic level. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen is expected to sign the deal on the 17th of this month. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Race to Power. But news and updates continue on WION. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.
This is our brand new edition.